I'm sure I'm not the only person who has contacted you after reading the book, How to Change Your Mind, which we talked about before we started recording this conversation, which I think is the best book I've read in the last couple of years. And there are a couple quotes that I wanted to read from that book to give a little bit of background information about yourself and the work that you do and some of the ideas that are posited in the book. And this, I think, dovetails pretty nicely into what you were just saying related to psychedelics and potentially a grand unified theory of mental illness. And there are a few here that I want to just tick through. And this is from the book, Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. Could it be that the science of psychedelics has a contribution to make to the development of a grand unified theory of mental illness, or at least of some mental illnesses? Most of the research in that field, from Robin Carhart Harris to Roland Griffiths, Matthew Johnson, and Jeffrey Guss, have become convinced that psychedelics operate on some higher order mechanisms in the brain and mind, mechanisms that may underlie and help explain a wide variety of mental and behavioral disorders, as well as perhaps garden variety unhappiness. This is a quote about you specifically. Jeffrey Guss, a Manhattan psychiatrist and a co-investigator on the NYU trial, thinks the moment could be ripe for psychotherapy to entertain a completely new paradigm. Guss points out that for many years now, this is him quoting you, we've had this conflict between the biologically based treatments and psychodynamic treatments. They've been fighting one another for legitimacy and resources. Is mental illness a disorder of chemistry, or is it a loss of meaning in one's life? Psychedelic therapy is the wedding of those two approaches. And then finally,
I still like that quote.
That's pretty good. Yeah. That sounds
like me.
Yeah. So many of the psychedelic trial volunteers Michael Pollan spoke to, whether among the dying, the addicted, or the depressed, described feeling mentally, quote, stuck, captured in ruminative loops, and felt powerless to break. They talked about prisons of the self, spirals of obsessive introspection that wall them off from other people, nature, their earlier selves, and the present moment. All these thoughts and feelings may be the products of an overactive default mode network that tightly links set of the brain structures implicated in rumination, self-referential thought, and metacognition, thinking about thinking. It stands to reason that by quieting the brain, networking responsible for thinking about ourselves and thinking about ourselves, we might be able to jump that track or ease it from the snow. I would love, just in transitioning from those quotes, to get the story or the memory that you might have about the trials that you were involved in that Michael talks about in the book. And I have to imagine, given the bureaucracy of a university and the stigma of a lot of these substances, that was a very high barrier to entry to allow a world-class medical facility and university to allow scientists affiliated with it to begin to do psychedelic testing to learn if there is something about these substances that might actually help people in very difficult times in their life. What do you remember about that investigation, how its difficulties in getting started, and what were you trying to, at least at first, what were you trying to test for? What was the initial goal or curiosity about using psychedelics in a certain manner?
That's a great question. After the Basel conference in 2005, my friend Alex Belser and I, we went to it together, came back to NYU, and we encouraged Steve Ross and Tony Bossis to start a psychedelic reading group, because you read all about these thousands papers that were published, and 40,000 doses were given. And so we thought it'd be a good idea to read some of this literature. But it wasn't long into that year that Tony Bossis brought forward his idea of doing psilocybin-assisted therapy for people with cancer-related existential distress. And so the idea of resurrecting or restarting the cancer-related anxiety research came about as a result of that reading group. And with Julie Holland, there had been, murmurings and attempts to get this kind of research started again. But, like a car, when you have to turn it over 2 or 3 times, it finally got going. In part inspired by all the people that we met there who were doing active research, in particular Charles Grove, who had going a research project looking at cancer-related anxiety. Cancer-related anxiety was something that had been studied in the 60s, both for the attenuation of cancer pain, but also the attenuation of cancer-related existential distress and worry. So we had the idea of replicating in many ways the Grove study, and also incorporating many of the qualities and patterns and procedures that were involved with the earlier 1960s research. And one person that connected those two is Bill Richards, who is still actively involved in psychedelic research. He was part of the Spring Grove team and brought his wisdom and experience forward through Johns Hopkins, and was a central part of their clinical team. So we did almost the same study as each other, Johns Hopkins and NYU. That study got its, conception maybe in 2006, but it really got birthed and started happening in 2008, and it lasted until 2013 for us to get those the 29 people who completed our study.